All right, hey guys. So I kind of messed up the first recording, so I was just doing an overview of all the videos before, but I don't think that's necessary. You can go back and watch them if you want to. Just as a very quick recap, in the first video we covered um, basically how clinical diagnosis is a staple of the medical model of mental health and why I think that's a problem. I gave three main reasons why I think clinical diagnosis is a problem, as well as some shortcomings of clinical diagnosis. The first was iatrogenesis, basically the idea that uh, having this medical model that we practice from can actually induce harm in people, as opposed to helping people when they receive treatment. The second one was that uh, it can this compulsory clinical diagnosis as a necessary step of our current infrastructure for delivering mental health care to people, in the sense that most people have their mental health care covered by insurance, and if you want your mental health care to be covered by insurance, you need to have some sort of diagnosis. So, because of that, some people are going to receive diagnoses that are either arbitrary or just inappropriate to what they're actually experiencing, even if they maybe don't clinically qualify for that diagnosis, um, just because that needs to happen in order for them to be able to seek medical care. So in turn, when you look at the data on how many people have, which different disorders, that data could easily be inflated in some cases and not reflect, other um, diagnoses that people are actually, experiencing more. So, um, that mental health data is potentially inaccurate, and I would argue that it probably is, and that's a big problem when it comes to research and the fidelity of academic research on and medical research on mental health. So, um, the third main point that I gave, which we'll talk about in this video, is that clinical diagnosis, how we practice it, how we think about it, and how we have woven it into the infrastructure of mental health care as a fundamental step in receiving access to mental health care, that it de emphasizes the influence of social causes and cultural normativity in mental health practice. Okay, so I'm going to talk about that first one. Again, that's the idea that clinical diagnosis de emphasizes the influence of social factors uh, in the development of what we regard as mental illness. Okay, and how it affects mental health um, from an environmental perspective. Okay, so here's a really great quote that I saw in a social work podcast. I think it's literally just called the Social Work Podcast. And I saw that one. I watched that one for my policy class last year. Um, so the person who said it, the last name is Bailey. I forget her first name, but she's a macro social worker. Okay, so her work doesn't focus on the micro individual level of mental health. In other words, giving people therapy. She's focused on big picture, social policy, that kind of lens. And she said it's not always the individual that needs to fit the system. Often the system needs to be changed. And I just found that quote to be so utterly compelling when we talk about mental health. Last time I gave the example of ADHD and how there is this, apparent epidemic of children being diagnosed with ADHD. It's not that I believe, and many other experts would believe, I'm not an expert, but um, that this doesn't actually reflect an increase in a pathology. It rather reflects how much or how little people, in this case students and school children, adhere to the cultural values that govern our society. Okay? So, in other words, it's not the case, according to the medical model of mental health, that school is utterly dull and boring and uninteresting, and that it doesn't allow children to express their curiosity and passion. It's not that sitting in a desk for 8 hours a day when you're like 8 years old is actually a very demanding thing to do. And it's that these kids have something wrong with their brain, that they have a pathological way of thinking and a pathological behavior. And it sounds harsh, but that is ultimately the ethos of the medical model of mental health. That there is, to use less polemic language, some sort of deficiency or some sort of defectiveness at a biological level that doesn't allow kids to essentially act how they're expected to act. Okay? But is that really a disease in the actual medical sense of a disease? Well, no, it's not. It's us adults looking at this demographic of people, children, and saying these behaviors do not align with the values of our culture. In other words, children are supposed to sit down and behave and do what they're told and be good little boys and girls and not, and just sit there while we talk to them. Okay? But that is, I think that's a horrible way to educate children. It's not the children's fault that they, are having such a difficult time focusing. I think it's the environment that is the problem. I think it's that there is a very strict curriculum that we have that's set up in such a way that if you miss a single step or a week in class, like, you're not going to catch up. Because, that's just how our curriculums are designed, and you have to learn it this way and in these steps, and it's extremely narrow-minded in a very real sense. So maybe you have different views on education, but I simply don't agree. I don't agree that this is how we should be educating children. I don't think that it's conducive to their growth as individuals. I don't think that they learn very much this way. And the things that we're teaching them, might not even be useful. It's kind of a running meme at this point, but it's, this idea of like, I learned the Pythagorean theorem, which I never use, but, I never learned how to file taxes. I never learned how to fix my car, things like that. Those things are important. They're relationships, Why aren't we teaching kids how to have healthy relationships? Why aren't we teaching teenagers what, healthy sexuality is? Healthy communication. And these things are life skills. But we're kind of like, no, you can just figure that out yourself, even though this is a central part of being human. And you just focus on some math that you're probably never going to use. And if you are interested in math, then, there's a bunch of other things that are basically just busy work. And our education system at its best right now is truly, truly lacking. And that's why I think so many educators are leaving, because I mean I have friends who are leaving the field because they're like, I don't agree with this anymore. And so anyway, that would be an example of a system that needs to change as opposed to individuals. Okay. I included a little comic here. As you can see, there's a little koala, and he's terrified and scared and probably depressed. And the psychiatrist, who is, very smart and intelligent and has a lot of expertise, says this young koala has a mental health problem. Okay? But as you can see, he has nowhere to live. The entire forest has been cut down. Okay? Is it the case that this koala has a pathology? Something wrong with its brain? That it's not acting right? And that the psychiatrist needs to teach the koala how to see reality correctly? And no, I think the koala is actually having a very normal reaction to an extremely sad and scary environment. And this is what our own medical model of mental health looks like. I'm not saying that there's no biological influence for mental health, okay? I want to be very clear on that. I know I keep saying that, but I want to be clear on my position. I'm not saying that there's no biological factors that play into mental health. You can easily see that things like diet and exercise have a huge role in mental health, but they're not everything. Equally, there's obviously going to be some role in brain chemistry, right? The amount of neurotransmitters present at whatever that's supposed to be. We don't know what that is exactly, as we saw in part 1 of this series, and it also doesn't have the final say when it comes to determining mental health outcomes. It just doesn't. Some diagnoses more than other. Okay, I will concede that. But because it's such a fundamental theoretical issue, it's hard to even look at a lot of research and really say just at a first glance like, yes, this disorder is because of a drop in this neurotransmitter, and like, yes, it's that. And it's like, the evidence just doesn't reflect that. And I know we talked a lot about depression and serotonin in the last one. But as we've seen in Gabor Mate's book, and I didn't include there are a few pages there, and I urge you to read that book because it is very good, and it talks about all of this stuff that I'm saying. It's not all biological, and personally, I believe that it's not even mostly biological. I don't even think that it's half and half biological. I think that biology serves as a basis for consciousness. You got to have a brain to be conscious. That's not, an option. But I think that ultimately the thing that shapes consciousness the most, and in this case shapes mental health outcomes the most, is going to be the environment. Okay? I'm open to other opinions. That's mine. So let's move on to the next part here. Research suggests that a focus on mental health through a primarily medical orientation de-emphasizes the influence of the environment on mental health for individuals and shifts social resources and attention away from preventative mental health care. Okay, preventative mental health care. I'll talk about that in a minute. Instead of emphasizing curative healthcare, instead emphasizing curative healthcare treatments for different forms of mental distress after they have already become problems. And that's actually not just my opinion, but there's research on that. I think this study is specifically on severe mental disabilities. So in this case, those would, be biological disabilities, things like mental retardation or trying to think, like developmental disorders, essentially, which is a little bit different, but I think it equally applies to mental health. So I want to break that down a little bit. So again, it not only, so basically all that, the example that I gave before, as highlighting a de-emphasis on the influence of social factors as contributing to mental health outcomes. How that happens is that this medicalized conception that we have of mental health leads us to shift social resources such as funding, such as awareness campaigns, as well as our attention, the thing that we're focusing on, away from preventative mental health care. So what does preventative mental health care look like? I'll use the example of domestic violence here, okay? Even though domestic violence isn't necessarily a mental health problem. And that's an interesting topic that I want to explore later. But this medical model certainly has ramifications for that as well. So, when we think about domestic violence resources for the public, what's the first thing that you think of? Victims, right? We think of domestic violence centers that shelter women who have been battered, or shelter families who are experiencing abuse from a domestic father or spouse, or whatever. And we focus so much attention on that. But how much time and money do we invest in the perpetrators of this abuse, in rehabilitating the perpetrators of this abuse so that they stop abusing their families and learn how to live with healthier relationships that allow their children to live in a home that is free of abuse, and for their spouses to have relationships that are free of abuse, right? That doesn't get nearly as much attention, in my perspective, okay? Maybe you have a background in DV and you know a lot more about that than I do. But from my perspective, there's way more agencies for victims than there are for the rehabilitation of perpetrators. Further still, we can compare those two, but what about if we compare programs that are designed to teach children and teenagers what healthy relationships look like in the first place, so that we can mitigate the extent to which they either become abusers or enter into and stay in abusive relationships. Okay, I know that there's a lot of factors that lead victims of abuse to stay in abusive relationships. I don't want to overlook that. I'm just saying, how much attention does this have of actually taking steps to encourage a healthier society so that these problems, even though they're going to come up, we can't control everything. How much can we mitigate it by preventing it? Okay? You don't see that a lot. I mean, you might get a day or two to talk about it in your health class in high school, if you even get that kind of class, or even if you even get sex ed, or but it's not a staple of our curriculum. And that's exactly what I'm saying, is that when we have this medicalized view and implement it as such, we're kind of just waiting for something bad to happen. What we should be doing, and I want to be clear here, because there is a little bit of nuance to what I'm saying. This goes beyond even something which is very good. This would be very good if we had this. A universal system of healthcare that provided equal and equitable access to all people. Okay? So that means that even if you're out in the fucking country, in the middle of nowhere, you can get healthcare too, access to mental health care, right? And you can afford it, because everyone would, under a universal healthcare system. Where's it going with that? Yeah, so basically it would be more than just making sure everyone has access to clinical therapy, talk therapy basically. Because talk therapy is designed to help people with problems that have already occurred. And yes, you can also, you can work on problems that you anticipate to come up in the future. I'm not, obviously that's a form of the clinical intervention process, or a part of that process. However, people don't show up to the therapist's office because their life is going well and perfect. People show up because they're in the middle of a crisis of some kind or another, and not necessarily a crisis per se, but because there's something wrong. And that's how we view not only mental health, but how we view healthcare in general. You don't go to your doctor to learn about how you should eat properly in order to reduce the risk of I won't say, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know, but you don't go to the doctor to learn how to prevent disease. You go to the doctor because something has already happened, because some sort of ailment is already present, and they try to fix it even though the harm has already occurred, whatever that is, or the disease has already taken place, whatever that is. What we should be doing is teaching people healthy habits that can prevent many, not all, but many diseases, through proper diet and exercise, and on the mental health side of things, proper stress management, and learning how to manage your emotions in a healthy way. These things are an afterthought to the goals of our society, which are wake up, go to work, do your adult stuff you got to do after, go shopping, go pick up the medicine, pick up the kids, make dinner, all that, go to sleep, and repeat for years, until, for everyone who's watching this right now, probably until the day you die, under our current system. If something comes up in that process that interrupts the flow of profit making and interrupts the flow of the goals of that the system of control of the culture of the society has determined for you, then you go to the therapist. Then you go to the doctor, because you can't do your social role. That's when it becomes a problem under the medical model. And the medical model isn't at fault here. It's just trying to adhere to the values of the culture, which is, let's get you all patched up and then back to work, and then, life is good. And it's like, well, not really. Ideally, yeah, but many people's quality of life from their work is pretty bad, and most people hate their jobs. And that's statistical evidence. It's not me being cynical. There are surveys, very recent surveys, that state this. So, my point is, this medicalized view places the onus of responsibility for mental health outcomes, for your own feelings of sadness, of anxiety about the future, on the individual and not on the problems of the society. Okay? If you have depression, it's not because this is the hottest year on record, as has been the case for the past decade, if I'm pretty sure longer. It's not the case that, the coral reefs are essentially sterilized by this point. It's not the case that there is a genocide that we are funding with our taxpayer dollars that is occurring in Palestine right now, and the fact that we as a country are giving weapons to fund this genocide, okay, that has killed almost 200,000 people, most of them children, in Palestine, on behalf of the IDF, right? It's that you have depression. You have this thing in your head where you can't see right? All of those things, that's a cognitive distortion. Okay, you are, you're not seeing clearly, right? And I, the clinician, will help you to see things clearly, so then you can, get back to work, and you can manage all your portfolio of capital investments, and just basically ignore everything that's happening in the world, and that is just not sufficient. It's not sufficient for individuals, because it fails to acknowledge the legitimate fears and feelings of depression and trauma that people have as a result of being in this world that is full of legitimate suffering. And if you think that it's not, I have a bridge to sell you. And if you're a social worker and you think that this is not the case, you have to go back to square one and really evaluate, do you actually embody, do you actually aspire to this thing that we're calling social justice? Because if you do, you need to take the view that experiences of depression and anxiety that we're calling mental disorders are no more disorder than a koala being terrified and scared that his entire home is now destroyed, and that he has nowhere to live, that maybe his family is dead for all we know, and that it is the same case with human beings. to pathologize the completely intrinsic normal human reactions that people have as a result of witnessing all of the problems that this society has is not just a disservice to the client. It fails to uphold the values of social justice that we as social workers must aspire to by virtue of the code of ethics that governs our work. This is especially true for social workers. And it is especially true for social workers who are practicing clinically to understand this. So, where do we go from here? Hopefully I've painted a fair picture to you of all the problems of clinical diagnosis. Iatrogenesis, creating a poor reflection in mental health data of the actual reality of the problems people are having in society, and de-emphasizing the crucial importance of environmental factors that play into a person's mental health and the outcomes of mental health. Okay. So, I didn't just come here to rant at you. I also have suggestions and proposals that I would like to make for actual alternatives that we can begin to explore as alternative methods of thinking about mental health, but also practicing mental health at the individual level, and as well as at the social policy level and the level of infrastructure. Okay. So, the first in the first video, again, we talked about how clinical diagnosis is a necessary step in receiving access to treatment. But to be more specific, clinical diagnosis is the assessment part of treatment, or is involved in the assessment part of treatment. When a therapist is evaluating the client to see what the problem is, that is the stage at which they diagnose the client and give their clinical diagnosis. We don't need to go too deep into it, exactly, what that looks like. But that is the general stage at which that occurs. And again, unless you can pay out of pocket, and specifically tell your therapist or find a therapist who doesn't diagnose, you will receive a clinical diagnosis as a necessary component of you being able to access mental health care and see a therapist. So, how can we assess, right? Usually assessment looks like this. You go in, you fill out a form, you kind of put generally what's the problems are that you want help with, and other stuff, and the therapist looks at that and they find different symptoms within that, and they line it up with whatever the best DSM-5 diagnosis is, and that's your diagnosis that you're working with. So, what are some alternatives to that? Right? Because to the extent that we live in a society, there's always going to be some form of bureaucracy. Okay? We can't escape that. I hate paperwork and this DMV stuff, and taxes and everything. I just hate it. I hate it so much. Okay? But if we want to live in a society, then we have to have some form of that for records and everything and organization and all that. So, because of that, we need to have some form of a model for mental health assessment and treatment. Okay? It can't just be do whatever you want, whatever goes, right? You gotta have something in place. So what are some alternatives? Well, thankfully, I think that despite all of its problems, again, specifically with respect to how clinical diagnosis is utilized and how it serves as a central tenet of how we view mental health, I think that the general infrastructure actually doesn't need to change all that much, though the way that we think about mental health does. So, but what are some alternatives to clinical diagnosis? Because again, as we've seen, that's what lies at the core, in my view, of the medical model of mental health. So what are some alternatives to that? ACEs surveys, surveys of emotional and physical well-being. And many clinicians already do this. I mentioned that there's some other stuff that clinicians have on there. Good clinicians will have on their intake forms. And they'll measure things like how much are you drinking? Are you suicidal? Are you, what are what does your exercise look like? What does your diet look like? They'll actually gather information on this that doesn't necessarily play into the diagnosis, but is still important to, understand you at a clinical level and to understand you as a person and to see where you're kind of where you're at in your life and just get a good picture of you to work with. So that already tells you a lot about the person, right? As well as all of the symptoms that they're coming with that fall under the umbrella of mental health. Feelings of depression, feelings of anxiety, feelings of, a trauma response. All of those things are legitimate reasons in themselves to seek mental health therapy. The fact that some people don't qualify for a full clinical diagnosis for something does not mean that they shouldn't receive treatment. Okay? And because of this, we need to find alternative models that reflect this imperative to help people who are suffering in one form or another. So, again, the surveys of emotional and physical well-being, that will tell you a lot of what you need to know, and psychological well-being as well, obviously. That will tell you a lot of what you need to know as a clinician about your client, if you are a competent clinician. I mean, if you feel like you absolutely need a diagnosis to be able to work with someone, you're just a bad therapist. That's the long and the short of it. And yeah, I hope there aren't. Unfortunately, I know that there are therapists who really put that much weight into the diagnosis, which is a shame. But not everyone, and not most people. Not most therapists, I believe. But that's still a bit subjective, even though the enterprise of mental health is subjective, because we're talking about subjective personal experience of the client. So of course it's subjective. That doesn't mean it doesn't matter. It's just a subjective domain of investigation and treatment. So, however, what do we do in order to fulfill this bureaucratic obligation that we have to living in a society and having some sort of infrastructure in place to, to have an appropriate model for, getting people to access mental health? Well, we shouldn't use clinical diagnosis for all the reasons that we talked about. But one alternative that I have come up with is to conduct something that many therapists already do, and that all of them already know what it is, and that is to conduct an ACE survey. So an ACE survey, ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experience, and essentially what it is a survey of how many of these different, there are specific types. This is a specific survey that's given out. It can vary in length. There's a long version, and a shorter version that's given depending on what the context is. But essentially it says how many of these specific types of adverse experiences from childhood that are significant and substantial enough to dramatically factor into your development as a person. How many of these different types of experiences have you had growing up? And here's some examples: physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, types of neglect, physical neglect, emotional neglect, as well as household dysfunction, other mental illness in the family. Again, without using medicalized language, I would interpret that as behavior that's unhealthy for a family dynamic. Okay, so if your mom is having so many depressive symptoms that she is in bed all the time and not taking care of you, that would be one example of mental illness as in mental illness in the family as being an adverse childhood experience for you. Incarcerated relatives, domestic abuse, substance abuse, and divorce. Okay, so I think I talk about it on this slide. That's something else. If you have experienced, this is what I'm proposing. If you have experienced any, even one, adverse childhood experience from this list, you qualify to receive mental health treatment. Okay, that is the new assessment criterion that we use to determine will a person be covered by insurance to see therapy. Because we know that these experiences have been empirically demonstrated, and I'm confident in saying this, have been empirically demonstrated to affect a person's development, not just as a child, but as a person. So if you have these experiences in childhood, it's going to affect how you are as an adult, because that's how development works. That's how human development works. So if you have experienced even one of these, you should be eligible to seek therapy, to seek mental health services, because we know, and I'm confident in saying this as well, at a scientific level, that these types of experiences alter your development. Okay? Now, you might be thinking, well, probably everyone has experienced at least one of these things, right? Even if, it wasn't physical abuse, probably someone's had a family member who has mental illness, if there was no emotional neglect, like, and I would say yes, that is exactly the point. Because as our society currently stands, we do not take healing as a serious, legitimate problem of our society. We see it again, and I'm that's kind of the whole point I'm trying to make here. As a result of the medical model, as an afterthought, okay? After something bad happens, after you go to jail for getting in a fight, or after you whatever it is, that only after that point do we really take it seriously. But we don't take the prevention part of that seriously. And so we think that, mental health problems have to be extreme, at the point, by the way, which it's very difficult to intervene already. Not impossible, but very difficult at a clinical level. And we just kind of like, yeah, well, if it's not super, I guess you're good. And it's like, we need to see healing as a fundamental part of being a human being. And access to mental health resources, whatever that's going to look like in the future, as a fundamental human right. Not just, oh, it's nice if you can get therapy if you have a lot of trauma. But something that everyone should have access to, because everyone, at some form or another, will suffer as a result of being human and being alive. That's just part of life. Some people suffer a lot more. Some people suffer a lot less. But everyone suffers in some form or another. And we need a system of healthcare. Not just nice talk, not just nice language, but an actual concrete system reflected in our social and political infrastructure that reflects this right to have resources to heal from whatever that is. ACEs creating a method of assessment for mental health treatment based on ACE scores would be one way of doing that. Okay? There are probably others. There have to be others. This is just the one that I thought of. So, yeah, that's one idea. Here's another idea. The Spiel model. Okay? So, what is the Spiel model? Just kind of a explanation of the... You know what? I'm going to read this real quick. I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. I really like this model. I don't know... This was kind of just tangential to my original presentation, but this is, really cool. Yeah, this is basically getting at the heart of kind of what this whole series is about. So the Spiel model is the solving problems in everyday living model. And it is a demedicalized, education-based approach to mental health, quote unquote. And it basically, if you read this, and I have to read this myself again because this seems really, really cool. It is a model of looking at what we're calling mental health, which is really just human experience, and looking at it in a way that is strengths-oriented, that draws upon people's inherent strengths and inherent power, the things that they're good at and the things that they have done well in their life and cultivated, the skills that they already have. It is solution-focused. It's oriented towards, okay, how can we help you achieve your goals? How can we help you to approach these problems that you're coming to therapy for, or to become educated, to help yourself. So that gets to the next point. An equal power exchange between the client and the clinician, okay? Because it is, you'll see here if you read it a little bit, it's a model that assumes, it's an educational model. More of an educational model than a clinical model, although I'm pretty sure it still has a clinical component to it, but an equal power exchange between the client and the clinician. Okay, so there's none of this, I'm the expert and I will teach you how to think and I will show you how your mind works and all this. No, it is a dynamic interaction between the client as a full person who's had bad things that have happened to them, okay? That maybe they've done bad things, okay? And the clinician who has information to give them and can act as a person who is willing to work with them on these issues that the client is seeking to resolve in their own life, and maybe even in the society as well. So this opens up the possibility of new forms of mental health care and treatment. This is very different than how we practice therapy now, and I wish I had explored a bit more of this. I regret that I don't have as much information on the alternatives that I proposed. But if you're gonna check one out, check this one out. The ACEs thing I think is useful in terms of assessment, but in terms of actual treatment, I think this is where I was going with this. The Spiel model seems to be an actual model of treatment that we can implement and begin to look to as an alternative to the traditional ways that we think about mental health, and more importantly, to the ways that we practice mental health. Okay, so please read this. I'm gonna read this. It looks highly interesting, and I'm really looking forward to seeing more about this. So